Today we'll be talking about the data retrieving part from a MySQL database through PHP, right? So this is the ideal scenario that we're talking about. We have the web browser. So this is where we access the content from the servers. So when we send out an HTTP request, right? So it might be a simple like a form filling like username, password to log ourselves into a type of a service that is provided over the internet, or else to send some content as a sort of in the form of a registration form. So we are sending out all that information. That information in the web server, right? What is being received by the web server is sort of analyzed, and it tries to extract the query that we are trying to run in this. So the query actually exists in the PHP script. The server, the web server, basically sends out that database query onto the DBMS. In this case, that happens to be MySQL, right? So that is where the MySQL statements or that query gets processed. And if a couple of records maybe matches with that particular query or the question that we asked, it will create something known as a resource, right? So it's not just plain data, it's basically something known as an object, and that is being sent to the PHP web server, right? Now, through the PHP script today, the next challenging thing, this is the part that we didn't have in the earlier cases. It was just the top part. We were sending out an HTTP request to basically store information into the web server. But now we have a reverse path as well, in the sense like we are fetching some content as well. And through the script, like, it needs to be done where the resource needs to be broken off into accessible elements, and the result needs to be given to the user in a more intelligible, more understandable level in the form of an HTTP response. So the web browser, again, as it was in the case with the earlier implementations, only gets an HTML document containing HTML tags, right? So all the processing here is done in the web server where the PHP part is being processed, right? Now the main concern here today is about how to handle this resource that is being passed from the database management system into the web server. Let's go for a code example and see how this resource actually looks like. Okay. I just created this file today called resource test.php, the normal way, PHP tags, and then I included the dbcon.php. And then just wanted to show you the contents of my database tables. So I just ran a select all from house, which got me this, and then select all from student, which got me the information that I've stored in the student table, right? Okay, so that is where we are, and this happens to be the structure of the database, the two tables. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fetch the content from the house table, which happens to be a simpler table amongst the two. So I'm going to sort of include a query there, query string, let's call it SQL equals a simple select command with select everything from the house table, right? When I do this, I don't store anything onto the database, but rather I get something from it. I need to equal this to another variable. So the $result happens to be the content that is fetched from the database into this particular script, right? So it's containing the result set of the query, right? So if we try to just simply echo this, echo $results, resource tests.php. Okay. So what it's trying to do here, it sort of generates an error and it tells me object of class MySQL result could not be converted to string on line 8. So line 8 happens to be this particular statement. It's trying to print it as if it's a string. But the problem is with it isn't a string. So rather than doing that, what you need to do is you need to sort of fetch the content in a sort of a different way. There are a couple of different ways that we can do that, right? But before that, just to see what sort of information is being kept there. Now the dollar result, there's another function that we can use in PHP called print underscore r, right? And then specify the dollar results. Okay. And let's now run this and see, right? So the normal echo statement failed, but let's see what the print underscore r returns us, right? Refresh. Okay. So this is what I get. Okay, let's try to analyze this and see. MySQLi result object. So they themselves here say that it's an object, whatever that was fetched from that. Say the current field set to 0, field count is 2. So the field refers to the number of columns, right? So we're referring to the table house, which has only 2 fields, HID and HName. So field count is 2, that matches with the description. Number of rows, num underscore rows, you can see it's giving us 4. So here we have 4 records. So in that case, that also matches with that as well. And the type is set to 0, right? So it gives us an idea about the information that is contained within the result object, but not the information itself. So what we need to do is, like, there are different ways of handling this, right? Commonly used cases would be these three: the fetch underscore assoc, fetch underscore array, and fetch underscore all, right? Now fetch underscore assoc there is simply, assoc means associative, right? An associative array. Now you might recall in Python, we had an associative array known as a dictionary, right? So in an associative array, what you do is you refer to the key of a particular record, and then basically the result will be given to us. Okay. So the description says fetch the result row as an associative array. Let's try to implement this and see. I'm gonna use the same thing. I'm gonna save it as by a different name. I'm gonna say fetch assoc.php, right? Now all of this is fine. Up to this point, it's all the same. But instead of just describing what the result set looks like, I'm gonna do something like this. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna introduce another variable called row, right? Row equals to. Now I'm gonna say, now I have the result with me, right? So the result is now a resource. I'm gonna take that, and inside the record, rather the resource, I'm gonna say fetch assoc. Okay. Now, what this implies is that you take the first record or whatever, a single record, and then you compile an associative array from it, right? Let's see how all of this looks like. Now I have a variable called row. Even if I try to sort of print this in the form of an echo statement, sorry. Let's try this and see. The file name is fetch assoc. Okay. So it's again having some difficulty in converting that array value into a string, right? So again, if we try to use the same method that worked out last time, that would be the print underscore r with row given as an attribute. Let's see how that works out. Okay, now it gives us something to deal with the content itself. Now it says array. Okay, it's a type array. That's fine. And now you can see the similarity with dictionaries, right? So HID happens to be the key, whereas the value here, that is Manel, is basically the value related to that. And HName, these HID and HName are basically the field names of that particular table, HID and HName, right? So those two, now keep in mind today we are only tackling a single record in this, right? So if you want another record to be printed in the same way, you will have to write this statement again. What is that? This one, right? If you just copy and paste another one, let's just deal with that. And then do the print R again. Okay, so what I'm hoping to do is take the next record, do the same for that, and then break it off and give me something similar, right? So if I do that, right, so sort of this part finishes over here. So what I've highlighted is the first result set of the first print underscore R, and this one is the next one, right? So you can see the next record is being fetched. If I go to the database, after Manel, we have Nelum, right? So in this case, you can see the first record is Manel, the second record is Nelum. So when you call this particular statement over and over again, it's simply moving on to the next row, fetching that content. Where is it now? It's in the result set, right? So it's in the resource. From the resource, take each record and break it off into an associative array, and then we can simply get the content likewise. Okay. So rather than now doing this now, if you have here in this case it's 4, you can basically have this 4 times and be done with it. But the problem is if you have hundreds of records and you don't actually have a proper count of what you have, then you will have an issue of doing this. So in such a case, the possible course of action would be to have a loop in place, right? Right. So what I do is I'm going to get rid of all of this. Now, I hope you recall what I did. I just sort of printed information about that row. In this case, it was capable of saying that it's an array containing the whole thing, right? So what if I want to sort of, address to these elements individually, right? So in that case, we need to sort of do it in a proper way. So let's do that. Okay, I'm gonna sort of keep this commented out so that y'all can refer to it later. Okay, now what I'm gonna do is today I'm gonna use a while statement. While $row. Okay, what I meant by that was while there exists a row. Okay, that's what it means. While there exists a row, basically do the breaking of the content and basically echo the statement, right? So the first row I take, whatever that has been taken in, I'm going to say echo, right? I'm going to use double quotation so that it allows me to print variables inside, which makes things convenient and easier. Echo and say this. Now, but keep in mind we're dealing with an associative array, right? So associative arrays, this is what we got as the result. And the keys are these, the HID and the HName. And the values are the different items that are there in the record. The keys are basically the column names, and the values are the items that are stored in those records, right? So I'm gonna address to what I'm gonna do is like, for example, I'm gonna sort of recreate the table, not with the actual table, just the information. I'm gonna say something like this. You will understand it, right? $row, right? And for me to be able to print the house ID, I need to call it by its key, right? You can see in this case, it's the HID, right? The field name. So I'm going to say HID, okay, and put a dash in between, and then say dollar row its name. Okay, and for me to sort of be able to break it off into a new line, I'm going to have a break statement as well, right? Now, right. So for me to be able to move on to the next row today, now what I have done is fetch the first record in the result set and then assign that to the variable called $row. And then I use the associative nature of that particular record. And then I, rather in this case, the array. And then I basically fetch the content from the HID, the value, and then HName, the key, the value related to that. Okay. So if I do that, then I need to move on to the next row, right? So it's simply like something similar to C equals C plus 1, right? So move on to the next row. You're done with this, move on to the next row. So what I do is simply, I'm going to copy this and paste it here. So what it will do is now it will initially fetch the first record and then basically use that for this particular condition. Is there items in this particular record? Yes. So then you break it off and then basically fetch the individual content and print it, right? And then what you do is move on to the next row, right? So it will sort of keep on going until it reaches the end of the rows in that particular result set. Okay. And one thing I need to do is for there here, okay, let me just run this for you. Sorry. If I refresh, it will give me an error because whenever you are dealing with array elements there, you need to, this is the array element that we're accessing, right? In that particular record, the data related to HID. In that record, the data related to HName. So whenever you are dealing with array elements in a simple echo statement, you need to sort of have them within curly brackets. It's a syntax rule that we need to adhere to. So it's simply making things more visible and accessible, right? So if I do that and save it, now let's run it and see. It gives me the results. So what it does is simply prints the HID of the first record, put a dash in between. This is the dash that we have here, right? This one. And then fetch the name part of it or the house name part of it and then print it there. And then bring the cursor to the next line because by the break statement. And then fetch the next row and do the same for that. Fetch the next row, do the same for that. Likewise, until there are rows, it will basically do the exact same thing, right? So this is how you basically access content using the fetch assoc construct, in this case, the method, right? So initially what I did was rather than simply using an if condition to validate whether the SQL worked out correctly, what I did was I sort of equal that to something known as a result, right? If you want to check whether this worked out properly, you can simply uh, say, use an if condition and say whether the result generated an error, right? Something like if so we can say whether if there is a result, then we can simply do this whole thing. Right. If it doesn't, then we can put an else statement and say error. Okay. should give us the same answer. But if we say something like a different value, say something like that, then it gives us error, right? So there's something wrong with the query, and then basically it doesn't give us the expected outcome, right? So like this is, I'm just gonna get rid of it for the sake of simplicity so that you all can properly understand. So, but I mean, when it comes to programming practices, those validation is quite necessary. Another method of accessing the array, or in this case, the results resource, is to have the fetch underscore array, right? Now, fetch underscore assoc keys again, it's actually a subset of fetch underscore array, right? Now, assoc means it's basically creating an associative array. But in fetch underscore array, it basically creates both, right? Let me just demonstrate this to you, right? I'm gonna get rid of this, basically the exact same part. I'm gonna save it by a different name. Go with fetch array.php. Okay. So up to this point, they are exactly the same. I'm running the same query for the sake of understanding. And then I connected to the DB, using the dbcon.php, connected to the database. And I have created a results resource using this particular query. Now we are getting some information down. We know what that is because the same exact query was run in the previous occasion as well. Now I'm going to use fetch underscore array to sort of deal with that, right? Now, how this works out is this. You can see fetch a result row as an index as well as an associative array. It basically fetches the content in both possible methods, right? Let me just explain to you what that is. So after obtaining the results today, what I normally do is I take the first row. Okay, so let me just create $row equals the result set is $result, right? It gets it needs to be broken down in this time using the fetch underscore array method. Okay. Now we do have a row in this, right? So now what we can do is we'll try to run the print r statement on the row and see what we get. Fetch array. Right. Now see what we have today. We have an array, right? So as expected, this whole thing is an array, but it's a kind of a hybrid array. Why is that? Because I'm fetching only the first row, right? So it says 0 implies the value man, in this case Mane, right? Also, without any like there's a bit of a space here, it says HID also refers to Mane. That means I can either by using the index. So you know what the index means. To access these elements, to consider a record, the first value happens to be 0, right? And the second value happens to be 1, right? So it's not being associated to the column names, rather by their positions, we are accessing them, right? That's why it's called an indexed or a numeric array, right? You being able to access the array elements, the items in a record using an index, right? A number 0 and 1, 2, 3, 4 according to what you are retrieving, right? Okay, so let's move back. Not only that, Uday, it allows me to fetch the content like this as well as it was in the previous case, right? We can have the exact same coding as we had earlier, and it will work out fine, even with fetch underscore array, right? Because it allows us to have both of this. Now, if you go to the the origin of this, you can say fetch array. There are three ways that we can get it. We can either like have it totally as an associative array, right? If we specify MySQLi underscore ASOC in our parameters in the attribute section of that, if we say MySQL underscore num, it will only be a numeric array, right? It will only allow us to access it using an index value. But the default one, which automatically gets assigned, is MySQLi underscore both, which we do not have to specify because that's the default, right? So that's what we have here. So it's the default one. 0 implies man, and then HID equals man as well. 1 implies Manel house, and HName also implies Manel house. So we can go with either one of these rules, right? So in the coding, you can say the same thing. While there is a row, you can say an echo statement and say, do you remember the curly brackets? And say now we're dealing with the the variable called row. Inside the row, we can specify. Right, let's go with the associative one and see whether that works. HID. And HName. You can have a break statement as well. Okay. And also over there, I'm going to just simply copy this and paste it here. Right. Save it and close this. Just keep this there. I'll be using that later on, right? Okay. So the result set, okay, let me just go through this. What I did was exactly the same thing. Instead of saying fetch ASOC, I said fetch array. Because if you just simply say fetch array, it supports both of this method by using the what do you call the key. I'll be able to access those elements individually. And also, if I change that to like an index, it should work as well. So that's what I'm trying to prove here. I'm going to save this and run it, which should give me, okay, which gives me the answers. Okay. So the same way over there, now see what I'm doing. I'm going to just change all of this. Rather than saying the column name, I'm going to say simply 0, right? And this one to be 1. Because the order of which how they are being stored is first the HID, and secondly we have the HName. So if I save this, doesn't change. So it basically gives me the exact same answer because fetch underscore array refers to both of this, right? But suppose if I just for the time being, if I just block this particular code segment out, right? And remove the comment over here and say, okay, now I'm going to say fetch underscore array and say MySQLi underscore ASOC, right? Now it's a different parameter that I've given. It's not the default one, which is MySQL underscore both, but it's MySQL underscore ASOC, right? So if I try to describe what the row looks like, if I save this and refresh, now you can see whether it's exactly the same as the fetch ASOC thing, right? Here we don't have that index to be able to access that particular elements using the index, but rather using the key value, right? Key and value combination, we can access it, right? So it simply works very similar to the fetch underscore ASOC. Okay. right? But if I change this to num, okay, and now run this. Now you can see it's only allowing me to access these data items using the index, right? If I say 0, it will refer to man. If I say 1, it will refer to Manel house, right? So now this code should work. I'm gonna comment this out. Save this and run. It should work. It's working, right? So because we're using the indexed approach into accessing the individual items. Okay. Now there's another one that would be the fetch all, right? The fetch all is simply not accessing the items row by row, but rather taking the whole thing at once, and then basically you can do whatever you want with it, right? Say it's like you might recall in Python we had something called read line, like whenever you say like read line from a particular file object, you basically retrieve the next line that was there in the file, right? So take line by line, you can basically access the content. But if you said read lines, right, with an S plural, then what you do is simply take all of the content from that particular file and then put that into in the form of a list, and then you can access those list elements items and then basically analyze them, and then again according to your application do something with it, right? So fetch all is exactly the same as read lines. So now I'm gonna save this as, just save this by a different name. Let's go with fetch all PHP. Right, the line that I'm going to change is this, fetch all. Okay, so here also there I can access the content using the three methods, MySQLi assoc, MySQLi num, MySQLi both. Now in this case, the default one is MySQLi num, right? So that means if you don't specify anything within these brackets, it will by default be a numeric array. That means you can access the items using the index. But if you say, for example, if you wish to access the items using their keys or else the field names, which actually is a better option of fetching content, because the row or rather the column order is, we say in database theory, that it's insignificant. So you might have a pre say set of columns, but it's always a safer approach to have the column names rather than a number to associate that particular column, right? So you can go with um, uh, MySQLi underscore assoc, right? And then basically fetch that content in the form of an associative array. Now let's, for the time being, comment this out. And remove the comments, right? Now this is going to run this, right? So I mean, it's not correct to say a row because we're not actually containing or retrieving a row, but rather the whole result, right? Let's call it data for the time being, right? Okay, let's save this and run it and see. Fetch all. Okay, so you got a lot of information today. For the time being, let me just break it off. I'm gonna use Notepad. Paste it. Okay, so let me just break and show you what we get. Okay, so so this is what you get for that. So you have a large array. This is actually known as a two-dimensional array as well. But anyhow, what you get is a larger array, right, which contains smaller arrays in the sense like all of these individual arrays are contained within another array. Understand? So this is what I meant by taking the whole thing, the whole set of records that is there in the result object, and then sort of put it into an array in the form of an array, and then you can access those individual array elements. Now these 0, 1, 2, 3, basically, even though they seem to be index values, they're simply referring to the row number, right? So row number 0, row number 1, likewise. So in the row number 0, you have an associative array, right? So you can access these items with HID being Manel, H name being Manel house, likewise. Okay. So you can basically do it like that. Okay. And same way, if you just remove this off altogether, right, and run it, you get something different. As you can expect, let's take the notepad again. Right. Now, I did not specify any parameter within the brackets today over here. I just said fetch all, right? So when you say fetch all, so by default, you know that it basically refers to the numeric array, right? So as a result, in my result set, you get the row number 0, 1, 2, 3. And inside each row, rather than having to deal with HID, which is the associative nature of things, we are using an index, right? The numerical approach into accessing the content of each of these arrays. So they basically do the exact same thing. Rather than saying 0 and 1, you can say HID and HName. But that is up to your preference. But the recommended approach is to have the associative nature when it comes to the individual fields and their values, because the order might change. You might be able to, if you just stick to this particular thing, the fetching, say for example, if I just fetch, rather than saying all, I can say hname, comma hid. So if I change it here, right? So this will not be impacted because anyhow it will HID will refer to MAN, but these two will differ, right? So then if we do that, I'm gonna save this and run it again. So this query result in this case, the array result is quite different from that, right? So I'm just gonna sort of show you an example. Okay, let's take the first one itself, right? Okay. So you can see with a 0 array, that's fine. But now 0 implies not to MAN, the HID, but rather Manel house, right? So now these two have changed, right? But this will not be a problem if you had stick to this one, right? So the best way to basically fetch content from the database is to use an associative array. But if you can't, then okay, totally okay. And if you're very sure about the column order and the fetching order and all of that, then it's totally fine, right? You can stick to an indexed array and then basically fetch the content likewise, right? Which seems like less typing sort of, but this is basically foolproof in the sense like if you wish to change your orders, then you will not be having difficulty in say fetching the content, right? So thereafter there we can do the exact same thing and then basically uh, address to that as well. Sorry, comment that out. Now, rather than saying while in this case, now keep in mind it's not a single record that we have, but rather a bigger list or rather an array, right? So we have a bigger array. Inside the array, we have smaller arrays, right? So we have opted to have this. Rectify the changes a little. Sorry. I'm gonna say all instead of that, and then I'm gonna say, yeah, let's go with MySQL underscore assoc, right? Fine. Now, rather than saying while Bude in this, I'm gonna sort of get rid of the whole thing and then say, you might recall there was a looping method just sort of allocated for arrays, right? That was for each. Yeah. And inside the for each loop, we had two parameters that would be the array itself, in this case, data, as now we can say $o. Right? Each of the values or the array elements, you consider that to be a row, and then now you can actually do the exact same thing what you did earlier. So you can say echo. Sorry. Can I just copy this? Row, its ID, its name, fine, and then also today, one other thing in for each is that you don't need to increment it, right? So it's already there, and then it knows how to move on to the next element, right? So that's basically it. If I just save this and run the fetch. It's the capital simple thing. It's case sensitive. So yeah, so we get that. So it's a totally different approach from the previous two cases, but here it works out the same way. MySQL assoc works as an associative array, and the whole thing is within another array called data, and then to access the different elements within that um, data structure called data, I'm using the for each loop, right? So which basically moves the pointer from one array element, which happens to be a single row, to the next array element, which happens to be the next row, right? So then you don't need to increase or repeat this particular thing again here, as it was in the case with the while loops. But for each loops has its own method of traversing through the next array element, right? So in all of this, Uday, might have not done it earlier. The connection needs to be closed, right? Okay. So that is about the content fetching part.